yeah, got it, fine, what's next? And the next week we'll go on. We have had some comments, some questions, and some requests for feedback on the topic from last week, which was basically here's a cosmological argument. A little bit of mixing together of a couple other arguments, at least referencing them in there, but talking about a cosmological argument. So we've had some follow-up comments and questions, and oftentimes, and I'll pick on Justin here, and he's an example of it, but you guys do this all the time. You come after class and you're like, hey, I've got a question. You ask this excellent question. And I'm like, why didn't you ask that in class? That would have been that's exactly the kind of thing we want for discussion. So please, don't ever feel shy about asking a question. If for some reason, I will only ever give two answers to it. Here's what I think is the answer to the question, / I don't know the answer to the question, let me look it up. And the other one is, we're definitely going to get to that one. Here's when we will get to that one. If you don't mind holding your question till then, please do. But if you insist and you're like, nope, I don't want to wait till then, I want to know now, then we're willing to go into that now too. Because I do understand there are some people, and of whom I'm one of these, who, until you answer a particular question that I think is related to what you're bringing up, I can't even hear you past that point. So I have some sympathy for that view. But in any case, we'll start with Justin's question. Justin, re-ask for the class, if you would be so kind.
Well,
the question.
Can you zoom in on your little box there at the bottom?
Yes, this one.
All right, so my point was on the personal one, and I've had this argument before with other atheists, and so there is this, followers of the religion of science believe that they'll take issue with that.
Tell me what you mean by followers of the religion of science.
People who are materialists who believe that everything will just, magically be figured out one day and that we'll all transcend. But really, it's about when you reach the edge of most science, there's this faith belief that you have to take on to believe that how these other things happen. And so, even like the guy you mentioned the other day, he has a set of beliefs that allow him to keep going past the point that he can't measure.
Okay.
But as a materialist, you should be, if you were consistent, saying that if I can't measure it, then it doesn't exist. But then, most of science has these areas you can't measure.
Well, yeah, almost. So I would say to that particular point, what he brings up, the concept of if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. This is not technically a metaphysical naturalist belief, but he's right in that the grand majority of, in my opinion, one guy's opinion, take it with a grain of salt. When you read the textbooks and you see stuff on quantum mechanics, almost all of the stuff that's at the university undergraduate level and below is done with this positivist view in mind. The positivist is a philosophical viewpoint that says if you can't observe it, if you can't sense it, even then, but if you can't sense it, then it's meaningless to even talk about it. So it's almost like it's not even that it doesn't exist. It's like there's absolutely no point in talking about it, and there's no way you can hold a belief in it. And so that positivist belief has leached its way in to many scientific textbooks as some sort of axiomatic belief or philosophical background to it. But sorry, go ahead.
Right, so the reason I call it a religion is because of the fact of the disconnect between the materialist belief system or philosophy,
okay,
and the belief that they have to kind of tie it all together or to exist, really. But anyway, so I've had this argument about the personal, and so you'll see this a lot recently if you read the Intelligent Design versus Darwin's theory of evolution, in that there's a lot of people bringing up the fact that they think that, they'll bring up arguments about, well, it's the fact that, odds are getting better over time, that things are getting easier, that basically it's the reason why we have an ordered universe, or we have a evolution the way we did, is that it just kept getting easier and easier, and success is built on success, and therefore it's that the natural world is set towards order. Now they don't like the word order because they'll say, oh well, it's just magic number theory, but it's really not. It's really, they believe that success builds on success builds on success, whereas experiments show the opposite. Natural laws show the opposite. So my point was about the personal. So I look at the fact that natural law says, goes towards chaos, that things are breaking down, that order is abnormal, and the fact that there is abnormal and that the amount of time in the universe doesn't allow for success to get there to the way we are and the ordered universe and stuff. And I say that there has to be a designer, whereas they would say, well, it's just because it just got easier and easier as success built, and that just seems crazy.
Okay, so how does now? I think I understand what you're saying. What I would say is now that I understand the point completely, let's hold on to that for some sort of design argument. I would note that at this point, although have started.
My question, though.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
My question was, I think your argument on why you should say personal is weak. You didn't say you basically didn't have any. You didn't have any reason to say that in what you've laid out so far.
Okay.
I remember, I thought, because I was looking at personal, I'm a little uncomfortable with it too, but nothing acted on this thing, whatever we're going to call this being, this power, nothing acted on it, so it had to decide, which implies personal.
Yes.
Of its own self, it decided.
Right, and what they would say is something that a trap you fell into, which is you said that before the Big Bang there were natural laws. I would disagree, but if there are, then it's like the ball is sitting teetering on the top of a hill, and it goes, and so it's rolling downhill.
So I did not say before the Big Bang there were natural laws. I said there are people, including guys like Stephen Hawking, who think that the laws of physics exist outside and before the universe.
Well, you wrote it down in your picture, so I
wrote down a whole bunch of stuff. But you'll do differentiate between what I believe and what other people are saying. You'll hear me say, personally, I think X, Y, Z.
Right.
In this case, I don't know that I agree with you that this wasn't addressed. We addressed this at some length. What we said was, if here's the Big Bang right here, where there's some state A of the universe, okay, this is in a purely materialistic view. There's no amorphous natural laws sitting out there. There's no angels, demons, God, anything. There's just the natural world. It's the universe in a singular state. It is in state A. And this was a question about why couldn't the universe be eternally old in the past? That was the question we were addressing. And then it just comes to be today. Well, the point is, all the scientific evidence we have today says that at some point in the past, like 14-ish billion years ago, all this universe was compressed into a singularity or something like that. So prior to that, we've talked about another view of, well, why couldn't you bounce through that singularity from the other direction? This was Sean Carroll's model, and William Lane Craig and Sean Carroll had a debate in which this featured. And he points out that basically the arrow of entropy, which is, and they claim synonymous with the arrow of time, basically time runs backwards to this point. And Craig pointed out that what you have there then is a singularity in which two separate universes move out from that quote-unquote point. So now what we said is, if you've got this kind of like dot that goes eternally into the past, and it's continuing in that state from eternity past, at some point it's A, it's A, it's A, it's A, and then it turns into B. How did it turn into B? So it's either the case that there's something about the state A that now has to turn into B necessarily, or eventually necessarily, or it's the case that something has to change and some decision has to get made, so to speak, to instantiate that movement from A to B. So if the universe is in such a condition that it stays in the state continually, then what possible explanation is there for why it changes to state B at some point in the future? Now there was a second argument that we brought to bear that said, if you keep going back eternally in the past, and each one of these dots represents a discrete point in time or something like that, then what you have to ask yourself the question of is it possible that we would have ever gotten to this point? So if there are an infinite number of points in the past, you never will have gotten to the point where A turns into B. So that's a metaphysical argument
Even if
against
it's
it.
without time,
Yep.
and you're in an unstable state.
So why, when you say unstable, what do you mean?
Balanced on the edge or something. It's that the A is unstable. That there's some other thing out there that can change it. They would say that it's not God, that there's some natural thing that makes it go, that it's unstable, and then it kicks off the Big Bang.
So if that unnatural thing is something like, let's use Hawking's view. Here are natural laws. Here's a natural law or laws of physics. The problem with these are abstract entities, right? By abstract, we mean it's not material. And furthermore, there's another property to abstract that you have to add. It's causally ineffective. A law does, the concept justice doesn't cause something to happen. The number two, the idea of the number two, doesn't cause something to happen. These are
The interaction of two laws can produce a second effect.
the two causally effete things in combination do not an effective thing make, though. You can't say I've got the law of conservation of matter and energy, and I've got the law of that 1 + 1 = 2, and that when you put those together, now that can have effects in a physical world. So that abstract objects, by definition, do not have causal relation, do not stand in any causal relation to physical things.
But there's no physical thing before the Big Bang.
That's fine, but the point is,
So it's all information. It's all whatever.
in which case, where does the physical stuff come from? Because what we're talking about here is the physical. The A and the B are talking about the physical.
A.
Yes,
Because
A is talking about the physical.
Big Bang. There's no physical.
Pre-Big Bang, we're talking about the point of the singularity. This dot represents the singularity of the universe. So it's all space-time, matter, and energy concentrated in one point. Concentrated in one point,
Right.
continuing to exist. Say again, in something else?
And something else.
Nope, that's not what we were talking about here. We're just talking about those things. Space-time, matter, and energy. Because remember, this is addressing a particular viewpoint. The viewpoint that this argument was addressing was the viewpoint that says time, space, matter, and energy extended infinitely into the past. And that the difference, that what we're trying to figure out is, when we look at at the portion of it that we can observe, all the evidence we have says that it all went down to one little dot at some point in the past, specifically 14 billion years in the past, according to a particular clock. So if the dot continued, so to speak, into the past beyond that, that's not immaterial. That dot is all the material. That's all the energy, and that's all the space and all the
In
time.
the past, it would just was.
Okay,
But-
if it was, and it was timelessly, then let A and B be a timeless state.
But a singularity point is not physical.
Yes, it is.
No.
It is in the laws of the Big Bang cosmology. It is.
No. I mean, how could you can't have a physical point that is a singularity because it just doesn't exist.
I happen to think that the concept of an infinitely small point that is real is self-contradictory. I agree with you there. But that's not what the physicist says. The physicist says that singularities are real. That every black hole that's out there is a singularity, a mathematically infinitely small point that contains all the mass of that collapsed star or whatever that black hole is. So it simply is the case that singularities are intended to be physical in these kinds of discussions. That is what the other side says. Now I agree with you that it's absurd to think that matter and energy and space and time can be compressed into an infinitely small point. I think that it has to have some radius r in order to be physically
Or it
real.
turns into information.
Yeah, but forget the information portion of it. We're just talking the physical portion of it here. You want to get to an information argument. These are not informational arguments, right? So hold your informational argument until later.
If I'm taking us down the wrong rabbit hole here, but so I'm like, last week and this week, I'm becoming more and more convinced that it started, right?
Okay.
You got me.
Okay.
And the personal piece, something had to act on it. That's why the personal or agency, whatever we want to call it. Something, someone, we're calling it God, acted on it to be that kicker charge.
Okay.
So my question is, what kicker charge started God?
Okay. Now,
Because if we're going to use the same,
absolutely. Now, this is a frequently brought up by the internet infidel community kind of thing, and it actually has a very easy question. Easy answer. I'm sorry. We have discussed it before, but it's hard until you get into this philosophical discussion, it's easy to miss. Okay, the universe is contingent. Almost everybody out there, philosophically and scientifically, believes that this is the case, that the universe is contingent. And what we mean by that is something very simple. This universe is a certain way right now. Here you guys are, sitting in this room, wearing these clothes at this time of day on this date. If the universe is contingent, if that statement is true, what that basically means is you could have chosen not to come here. And you wouldn't have been here. You could have not brought coffee. You could have had something different for breakfast. You could be wearing a shirt of a different color. If you think that those statements are true, if you think that it's possible that you could have, that something's different than the way that it actually is, that means that you think that at least this universe is contingent. That means to say it didn't have to happen this way. God is, when we talk about the concept of God, what do we mean when we talk about God? When we talk about God, these are not the only properties of God, right? We usually add a bunch of properties to these properties when we talk about God. We add things like all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, that kind of thing. So there are more properties than those, and contained in those properties is the following belief, that God is necessary. And what we mean by necessary, Necessar, God is necessary. That means God could not be a different way than the way that he is. Okay, so let's take this necessary concept back to the universe. I have read at least one philosopher who says, yes, this universe is necessarily so. That is to say, you think you could have worn a blue shirt today or a red shirt today, and you're mistaken. You could not have. Everything that happens by absolute necessity. There's no way this could possibly have been different. Most people don't agree with that because it seems fairly obvious that things could have been different. But you can hold that belief if you want. If you believe the universe exists necessarily, then all of this stuff happens because there was absolutely no other way for it to happen. Now, how do you make the argument, or why would you even bother contending that God is necessary? Well, what we mean, when we talk about God, philosophers will use this term, that God is the greatest possible being, and that's the definition of God. If you want to define God in the shortest possible way, this is the way to do it. God is the greatest possible being. Because you get all of those other properties out of this definition for free. God's the greatest possible being. Well, is there somebody more powerful than God? Because if they were more powerful than God, then they would be greater. Nope. God's got the greatest amount of power possible. That means he's capable of doing anything that's logically possible to do. That's what it means. Okay, but God doesn't know certain things. Well, nope, if it's logically possible to know, then God knows it. That fits in the definition. Now, it's important. I've heard some folks, and I had some discussions this week, one of which included, good grief, Matt Slick of the Atheist Experience. I heard a panel there talk about, they looked at an argument that we're not looking at now, but an ontological argument, where they protested that okay, well, all you have to do then is say that something is necessarily existent, and now you've got the same magic that you got out of defining this God as necessary. So that you might say that here's a unicorn, there's a necessarily existing unicorn. So it's a unicorn, well, how do you know the unicorn exists? You don't know, okay, wait, hold on, it's a necessarily existent unicorn. So now, voila, it exists. So what's the problem with a necessarily existing unicorn? A unicorn is a physical instantiation. So again, you've got to have a unicorn in a universe like this. Unless you think that a physical universe, that it has to be the case that a physical universe exists, then a necessarily existent unicorn is a contradiction in terms. You following me?
Not really.
Okay.
So is math necessary?
Say again?
Is math necessary?
Some people will make the argument that mathematical truths are necessary truths. By the definition of one, by the definition of plus, and by the definition of one, then by the definition of equals, all of that is equal by the definition of two. All of that is necessarily the case. If you define each of those terms the way that we conventionally do, then it's necessarily true that those exist. But we do believe that those are abstract objects. We don't think that there's a one running around somewhere and you have to grab it and you have to add it to this other one. These are abstract concepts. So there are at least two views on abstract ideas. One view is that abstract things that exist somewhere in reality outside the physical universe. Other people believe that they are mind-dependent ideas. That is to say, the concept of 1 + 1 = 2 does not exist in reality until it exists in someone's mind. Now, to the theist has a resource that the atheist doesn't. The atheist who wants to say, or the metaphysical naturalist who wants to say, these things do exist, but outside of this physical universe, outside of some reality, they have to posit this other space, this non-material space that exists of abstract objects. The theist is relieved of that burden by saying these exist in the mind of God, and so they are true, they are eternal, necessary truths, but they exist contingently upon God. God existing necessarily and knowing all things necessarily means that they exist necessarily in God's mind. So you get these necessarily true statements of definition for free.
Kind of two questions. So could God be...
And I'll be back to finish and answering your question in a way.
Could God be contingent? And then also could the unicorn just be outside supernatural and be the same as God?
The answer to the second one is yes, but you start to erode the definition of unicorn so badly that it basically equals God. So the greatest, if God's definition is the greatest possible being, then no, by definition, he cannot be contingent. Because one of the properties of being the greatest possible being is that you exist necessarily. Why would we think this? These are just concepts. We're comparing one concept to another and saying which of these concepts is greater than the other if some sort of greatness relationship can be established between them. So what you might say is this: okay, well, I can picture in my head a God who's all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, blah, 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 but he's contingent. And then I say, great, I've got a competing view of God that says he's all those things you said, plus he exists necessarily, he has to exist. Which of those is greater? If you think necessary existence is a great-making property, and I happen to think that it is, then now this is the greatest possible being, and this is a quasi-maximally great being. Now, God is not a quasi-maximally great being, so this definition is now the definition of God. Now, some people will protest, this is simply defining something into existence. But when you're doing philosophy and you're trying to say, does this idea versus that idea, what is justice, what is injustice, what is truth, what is falsity, that's all you're doing there too. In fact, all of our inquiry for knowledge is doing what we just did. If the concept exists and it's not self-contradictory, then it's possible that it exists. Now, later we'll get to an ontological argument, which is not satisfying to most people, because most people don't get into the philosophical side well enough to understand these differences between contingency and necessity. Now to your second question, and then it will answer your question, and then I'll get to your question. What about a necessarily existent unicorn, where we divest the unicorn of these properties of having to be an actual horse with an actual horn on his forehead, that kind of thing? Okay, well, by unicorn, I don't mean a horse with a horn on his head. I mean an immaterial idea of this. Okay, well, why does it exist necessarily? Why idea of a unicorn? Well, again, remember, you're getting the horse in the way, so we don't mean that. What I mean is a being that exists outside of space and time. Okay, a being outside of space and time, but that's not that doesn't have to be a necessary one, does it? Is it possible that your being outside of space and time is contingent? Well, my unicorn that exists outside of space and time is special in many ways, and it has to exist that way. So what you've really said is now is a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, necessarily existent being. And these are simply the properties of God. So we've called it a unicorn, but in reality it's God. So, and this is why the definitions are important. So if the word unicorn you think actually applies to that thing, then yes, God's a unicorn. That's fine. But remember, it's an all-powerful, all these properties of God. And calling it a unicorn seems, maybe you could properly call God a unicorn in that the modern definition of unicorn is there's only one of those that exists, right? And it's very special. Huh? Yeah, you're right. So I'm comfortable with your definition of God as unicorn. Okay. Now, to your question, why can't God, how does this work? How does this argument not run on God? It only works if you think that the universe is contingent. And like I said, almost everybody thinks the universe is contingent. So things that are contingent need a cause. So here's your little matrix. Things that are contingent need causes. Things that are necessary do not need causes. You don't need a cause for 1 + 1 = 2. It's a necessary truth, right? Nothing has to cause that to be true. It is simply true. So let's put check marks on things that are in our little list here of things that are that need contingency in order to be true, need to exist in some contingent way. Okay, the contingent, God does not need a cause because he's necessary, and that's it. So it feels like a simple argument, but I think that it is a fairly simple argument.
I'm not going to argue with what you just said, but it's.
No, feel free. That's what this class is for.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think anything that you said right now is wrong, but comparing like the concept of, 1 + 1 = 2, that being necessary, and
Yes.
God who's not necessarily, or who only was in physical form once, right? And then like he just exists. So I think it's kind of like apples and oranges, you know what I mean? Like I get that he exists necessarily, but I still have a hard time rectifying in my mind that means that if there was a start time for the universe,
Yep.
I guess it just comes to like operating outside of time, and I'm probably never going to be able to understand it. I can't wrap my head around.
I'll give you
or
two.
visualize.
No, your question is an excellent one. It's one that I spent a lot of time thinking about and wrote a paper on. So I think your question's so good is worthy. At least I thought it was good enough for me to spend a lot of time on. Let's go back to our now increasingly complex diagram here, and we say this. All right. So I think Justin kind of pointed out that this. If the dot is in a timeless state, it's not really moving back dot for dot, right? Here's this dot right here that is either the singularity for those that believe in it. For Justin and I who don't like singularities, then it's all of space-time, matter, and energy compressed as tightly as reality will allow it to be compressed and still be real. Okay, whatever that radius is, whatever that minimum radius r is. Okay, and then it launches out from here. Into the current universe that we observe, all right? And that it was basically sitting here in this state the whole time. Okay, now we're going to call this T0, and we'll call this slice, T1. We'll call this next slice, even though they should be, right smack next to each other, T2, ... All right, so this is the time moving on out. What keeps this thing from... if it's sitting there in a timeless state. So one view is that God is timeless without the universe and temporal with the universe. So if you kind of put God at this dot in time, there's not to speak, and he's sitting there timelessly, and he makes a decision, create, and now that actually starts time running. Okay, that's one view. My own view is something like rats. I wasn't going to get into it, but I guess I'm going to get into it, aren't I? All right.
Is this the Trinity argument?
Yes.
So that multiple parts, one part in time.
Where did I put this in files?
I promise I wasn't trying to derail you.
No, you're really good at it. So congratulations.
It's a rabbit hole worth jumping in.
It is. I don't know where I am here. Oh, browse. Let's see. My cloud.
Basically, is it God's existing out of time in different persons, right?
Yeah, so my own view is this. Yeah. I tried this without the pictures one time, and nobody got it. Or at least I didn't think they did. All right, so is this the way that the world is? You got a singularity right there at T0, and then there's T1, there's T2, there's T3. You can see it kind of marching along. All right, that's one way of thinking about it. Here's another way of thinking about it is there's a singularity sitting over there at the left side, and then when expansion begins, time begins. But doesn't it look to you like, well, if the singularity was there and then it's the same, it seems like that's just in time. How are those not temporally related? They're causally related, and if they're not temporally related, what does it even mean to be temporally related? So to me, it seems fairly obvious that like if you can stick it in a timeline like that, maybe it's in a timeline. All right, so that's my own question was how do we do that? Now or is that the way that things work? So I've talked about now think about that which exists necessarily. So that which exists necessarily, we've talked about here, that could either be God or God and abstract objects, laws of physics if they happen to be abstract and necessarily true. Although the interesting thing about the laws of physics is most people think the laws of physics, many of them are contingent. That is to say, the constants and quantities that are in there are not necessary. They're contingent constants and quantities. But whatever laws are immutable and necessary, then they would be here. So here you are at T0 in the necessary world. So that when by necessary world, we just means that world with only necessarily existent things. And then you get this march in time forward. Is that the way that it works? Or do you stick to singularity? And this is, I think, what we have to say. Here's a necessary world that sits somehow before the existence of the singularity. And here's why I would say that. If the singularity does not go back eternally in time, and we've made that point in here, why metaphysically speaking and physically speaking, that cannot be the case. Then what you have to do is say this. There was a state where the singularity did not exist. And then there was a state where the singularity did exist. And then there was a state where it started to expand. You've at least got those 3 steps, right? If you've got those 3 steps, and it's the case that the singularity did not exist necessarily, that is to say the universe is not necessarily existent, which we've made the case for in here, then that's what your timeline has to look like. Now, here's my question to you. Doesn't that put that which exists necessarily in some sort of temporal relationship to these other things? Some philosophers say no. I happen to think, since I can stick it on a timeline there, at least conceptually, that seems to be like a yes to me. Now the question then is, fine, we got a problem with, if we're going to say that the universe doesn't get to sit there in the necessary space and then start to expand, then why is it not special pleading that we're going to stick God over there? I have some sympathy to that view, and I don't know why this is all compressed and squished, but this is how I think it works. That in order for God to be this way, where he is not part of a contingent universe, that they're at some kind of T0 where time is not flowing, it's just like an initial point, you can be timeless at T0 if you want to, that you have 2 persons of God, that God is at least bipersonal. One person stays timeless and always will, and in fact, it's the case has to, in order for that to be God. A second person must exist in time. Why? Because if God is going to be all omnipresent in all space, or he's going to say he's going to be omniscient, he has to know truths like this. It's Sunday, October 27th today. God has to know that. If the present is real, God has to know that as true. So if God knows that as true, there has to be some consciousness of God that's sort of, quote unquote, ticking along with the universe. William Lane Craig's view is that God starts out over on that black dot, and he's timeless, and then when he creates the universe, he stops being timeless and becomes temporal. I argue differently and say timelessness is an essential property of God's, and you cannot abandon an essential property without abandoning that which you are. God cannot abandon an essential property, so what it means is if God chooses to create a contingent reality, he has to be at least 2 persons. Now this could be what we commonly call the Father, or our brothers would call the One, and the Spirit of God would possibly be that other person. So at least, but in this viewpoint, you've got to have at least 2 persons to the Trinity, which is part of my argument for why the Trinity ends up being necessary. There's more to it than this. I don't want to get into that at this point, so let's leave the Trinity stuff out of it, because we will get there eventually. But to the question about, like, how does God not enter time, I think he kind of, quote unquote, leaves behind the principal consciousness of God. The Father's consciousness always remains timeless and necessarily existent.
So then backing this up, I guess what we're saying is he's at least two people, 2 things, right? One is timeless. And if that timeless being is timeless, ergo it never needed a cause, it never needed a start, it's never had a start or an end.
It's not just that it's timeless, it's that being is necessary.
Necessary.
Yes.
Okay.
It also happens to be timeless. Yeah.
Okay.
Being necessary also entails timelessness, unless time exists necessarily.
Okay. Do you have a timeline that shows a timeless time?
There can be a timeline. Would not be. Yeah, right.
There's a way to visually
So if you're going to do that, it's a timelessness would be a dot. If there was such a thing as an infinitely small point, timelessness would be a dot. That's it. And so the questions I'm asking is like, if we know there are other dots, how do you link that dot of timelessness into these other dots without them being in time? And my point is, something has to stay, kind of quote unquote, at that timeless point. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I've been ignoring you for a while now.
Get back to the Bible.
Only in solid ground would that statement be made. Okay.
That's sort of what first chapter of John says.
Yes, I would say it dovetails very nicely with this viewpoint. In fact, I've used
You
it.
stated it in one way, and now you're stating it in all of this.
Yeah, and in fact, we talked a little bit about this last time. Some people have noted that he's talking about the verse that says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And now that sounds like there are kind of two things. There's God and there's the Word, but yet he's saying God and the Word are the one thing. This is not
Things were created
through him.
So it's like there's somebody else there.
So I happen to think that supports this view very nicely, right? And part of the reason I maybe developed it. But this is not a uniquely Christian belief. Before John wrote this, a Jewish philosopher named Philo wrote this. And this viewpoint has kind of like God as this big circle here, and that the mind of God, so here's God, and here's the mind of God, and that the mind of God moved forward into this timeline kind of thing. This is a very inexpert explanation of it, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's to the panentheistic view, which I have some good sympathy for with the caveats we made. This would all actually still exist in this circle, but that the mind of God somehow moved into instantiating that which was real. But yes, to your point, I think it fits.
Well, so can you go back to the one that you had with the contingent universe? I'm sorry, the universe. Basically, you say that the universe is contingent, and then God is necessary. Is there one thing that I've wondered is, could everything, I guess, except math, can be contingent, or there'd be enough things that are contingent that one could argue and get around the necessary part and still kind of say, okay, it's okay that the universe exists as it does, even though it's all kind of contingent. It was just kind of, there's all these contingent factors or all these things that are kind of, probabilistic, and we just happen to catch the most optimal probabilistic thing, and it's more optimal it's more likely if all the possibilities of whatever was contingent happen together, and it seems unique to you, but that's an argument that I've heard. I'm butchering it.
Yeah, as I understand your question, what I would say is anybody, and I can probably generalize it and make it simple. Anybody who says, as part of their argument, this, and almost everybody who's arguing from some sort of quantum mechanical realm can generate this kind of stuff. Anytime you use the word probabilistic, you're almost always, so let me back up. Whenever you use this word, you're almost always meaning this. There's some epistemic, and by that I mean like I don't know what it's going to be. So think about cards, right? There are two cards dealt on the table in front of you. One is you're playing blackjack, and one of them is a king, and the other one is something else. You can compute the probability that other card takes you to whatever number you're gunning for, 21. That other card is an ace. You can do the probability. It's one, given that there were 52 cards originally, one of the cards is already face up. Let's pretend nobody else's cards are up there. Now there's 51 cards left. There are 4 of those. There's a 4 in 51 chance that's an ace sitting there. Now you can say a probability. That actually doesn't affect the reality, right? That card is what it is. You flip it over and you were either right or you were wrong. So often probabilistic reasoning has to do with when we don't know something, but it still is. Now, that's just something to keep in mind. Let me give you something else. When you say probabilistic, that absolutely means contingent. Right? Because there's only one number that is unity, and that there's never a probability of 1. right? Once you hit 1, you're no longer in a probability. That's determined to be the case. There's a probability of 1 that X will result from Y. That means it's determined. It is deterministically true. It is trivially true. It is necessarily true that B will come from A, or that Y will come from X. So if you use the word probabilistic, that always means some number less than 1. It's not equal to 1. And if you do that, then it is, by definition, contingent. So anytime that someone tries to say something is necessary and probabilistically so, this right here is the defeater to that viewpoint.
But what if they say it's all contingent? And that because there's so many possible worlds, and you just stumbled into the one, and it seems like unique to you, but you weren't aware of the infinite other possibilities that just didn't work.
So this is where
it's all contingent.
You can do kind of a possible worlds analysis of this, and you say something like this. Does there exist a possible world? That is to say, is there any conceivable world? And world doesn't just mean physical universe. It means like any way things can be, where 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And if the answer is no, and by the way, the answer to that is no, then this is necessarily true.
So if there is some necessary truth, there can all be contingent truth. Like, not contingent things. If you can prove that there's at least one, well, a mix.
If you can prove that at least one necessary thing exists, then the statement, necessary objects exists, is true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but I go on to Jesus being a physical person. Wouldn't that make him contingent and therefore not necessary, not being God?
Yes, yes. If that's the way, yes, that's correct. And I'll talk about how I get around that objection later. To me, what's not obvious from what I've said so far, if you bought everything I was selling, that doesn't get you to the Christian God is the correct version of that. That's correct. There's more work to be done to show that. Good observation.
Timeless, because in some ways I would think of timeless as unchanging, but then we talk about personal, and personal by definition is I flip the light switch of the universe.
Yeah,
which is change.
you're near and dear to my heart on that one. I think time and change are identical. But I will say, for those that don't believe that, and I think that's a majority of people, then I would say this at least. It is not possible to have time without having change. Now, some person may say, let's freeze this room right here, and nothing changes at all in this room. Like all the way down to whatever the smallest possible level is, nothing in this room changes. Sorry, go ahead.
Accepting all of that.
Okay.
I think my real question is, if God is timeless,
Yes.
how is he personal? How did he move from something that was completely unchanging to affecting change on something?
It depends on whether you believe the following statement about consciousness is true. You may have free will, you may be conscious without thinking through a series of things. Now here's how I'll say that. Let's say you and I are thinking about, or you're thinking about something, and you say, okay, I think about this number 1. What is the number 1? I think the number 1 is this. Okay, can there be another number 1? Maybe so. I've got 2 number 1s. What can I do with these 2 number 1s? Can I add them? And you've now sequentially worked your way through. You've learned something. You've learned what the definition of 1 is. You've thought through and you've learned the definition of plus. You've learned equals. You've learned 2. And maybe you made them up, or maybe in any case you learned them. You went from one state where you didn't know it to a state where you did know it. If God is necessarily all-knowing, he knows what 1 is, he knows what plus is, he knows what equals is, without having to think through it. He just knows all of it at the same time. So this actually features as a key portion of this argument that I'm trying to make, that this is what God's knowledge. So this is a diagram that shows possible worlds. So that which exists necessarily, I call the necessary world. Philosophers are going to get exercised about this right here, because a possible world is supposed to be all of the ways that all of reality could be. I try to make the point of like, that's true, but it's also meaningful to talk about worlds at particular discrete times in the past. So let's pretend that 2.3 or 1.1 up there represents that our world starts here at the first dot, it goes to that next dot, and it could have gone to any of those next 3 dots, but it goes to that dot, and then the world just stops. It either goes out of existence or just freezes there. So that was the end of that possible, of the entire universe. That's the way the universe was. That's the end of it all. It ended in state 1.1. Pretend that that's the case. Now, if it's a contingent world, what we say is, it could have gone to state P1, and then it could have gone to state 1.2. Didn't have to go to 1.1. It could have gone to 1.2. So this coulda, shoulda, woulda analysis is possible worlds, how a possible world unfolds over time, and all the possibilities it could have. Now, let's say that here are all the possible worlds. These are all the ways the universe could have been. All the worlds, and by universe, remember here, I mean all of reality, the way all of reality could have been. It started out with just that which was necessary, abstract objects if that's it, just God if that's it, whatever. Then maybe P2 is the singularity and whatever else is out there. And then P2.3, and then that was the end of it. That's the way the actual world's going to be. God's knowledge looks like this. This is a set. God knows possible world 1 could have happened, and that in possible world 1 are things like unicorns, are things like 1 + 1 = 2, or people wrongly saying 1 + 1 = 3, right? That there are people who are like that and that they would say something wrong. So God doesn't know false things, but if it's true that Steve and Scott messed up on their math and we got it wrong, he would know what that looks like. So these are all the things that God knows. Now, interestingly, if God knows everything, doesn't it make sense to say God also knows, kind of quote unquote, knows his own mind? And he knows which of all these possible worlds he will instantiate, he will make real. And the answer is, yeah, it seems to me that the greatest possible being would not only know all the possible worlds out there, he'd know which of those is the actual world. So God can freely, and did he have to do it that way, or does that turn out to be his choice? And we say if he's the greatest possible being, he doesn't do things because he has to do them. He does things because he chooses to do them, because the greatest possible being would have free will. And so as a result, he knows which one he's going to choose. But he doesn't learn that. He knows that in the same way that he already knew what 1 was, what plus was, and what 2 was. So this takes a little noodling through, but Katie, the answer to your question, at least as I understand it, is this, that God knows all that stuff. And you say, well, okay, fine, how does he go from that to quote unquote flipping the switch? By this being the case, by it being the case that he knows what that will be, and furthermore, he knows that he chooses to do that. The first person of the Trinity, or of the binary, or whatever the binity would be, the duity, whatever 2 would be. I don't know what that would be. The first person of that one knows that. The second person is the light switcher. So you have to have the 2. Now the question is, to the point that you brought up, and this is starting to answer the question that you asked. If it was the case that the Father, the One, does not choose to instantiate a universe, there would not be a Trinity. There would only be one. But if he freely wants to, desires to, if he always has or timelessly has the desire to create a universe where, fill in the blank, loving people, whatever, if he wants that, then necessarily the second person exists and has to exist, because he cannot possibly do that without there being 2 people. So this takes some noodling through. This is not the class to do it in, but I wanted to be able to at least answer your question, because I think it's a very good question.
Going back to the comment that you made about time and change, right? And time and change being synonymous. Going with what you just talked about how there's one part of God that pretty much has the set, that knows everything, right? And not getting into not shimmying over to the free will piece of this, because that could go down a whole other rabbit hole. Okay, so I would say like us thinking right now, right? Like that is a physical change over time. Like your neurons are firing, thoughts are being created in your head and stuff like that, right?
Yep.
God in this
model doesn't do that.
Is it physical? Right. Therefore, time doesn't need to exist for him to be able to.
Yeah, to give a simple definition, I would say this. God is timelessly conscious of all true propositions. That's the simplest that I know how to state it.
It almost sounds like you're saying the switch was always flipped.
That God knew this. It is always the case that God knew the switch would be flipped. The first person, and be specific. It's always the case that the Father knew the switch would be flipped. Because it's always the case that the Father knew the switch would be flipped, at least one other person, the Son or the Spirit of God or whatever. Go back to Genesis 1:1. assuming, tell me if you guys disagree with the the English translation of the Hebrew on this one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the deep. There it seems like that we've got God and we've got the Spirit of God. Now, nobody, I'll let these gentlemen speak for themselves, but the Jewish belief is not that God and the Spirit of God are two separate beings. It also shouldn't be the Christian belief that these are two separate beings. That whatever the Jewish understanding is of how these are one should be the Christian understanding and vice versa. But any version, most versions that I hear of Trinitarian thought are basically tritheistic beliefs. They basically say, we're calling it one God, but in fact there are three gods. That here is kind of sitting, and there's one God sitting in this throne, and sitting in his right hand is basically this other God, and the Spirit God we don't really say where he is, but he's there somewhere too. But these are basic. It's tritheism, and this is one of the objections that I have to a lot of the Trinity theory that's not necessarily said here, but you hear in Christianity all the time when people try to explain it. I don't think that's the case. I think it's. I will get into that later, but yes, sir.
Just a quick question regarding the universe being contingent versus necessary.
Yes.
I get that general argument. If I understood you correctly, if the universe is necessary, then me being here had to happen.
Yes.
That's that.
Yes.
How can a Calvinist make that argument regarding the universe being contingent? Can they make this particular argument for the existence of God?
If I was putting on a Calvinist hat, which I'm loath to do because I'm not a Calvinist, but if I put on my Calvinist hat, I could defend that, I think, by saying this. It's contingent because God could have made it different. So God could have chosen you to, if he wanted, he chose you to be Jewish. But if he wanted to choose you to be Hindu or Christian, he could have done that too. It's totally up to him. Yeah. Now I think we'll get to that one later too, but yeah. That is the rabbit hole of all rabbit holes, the mother of all rabbit holes.
I missed that last comment. Are you saying that Calvinists implies a contingent universe?
I believe that he's leveraging the point. Shake your head if you're wrong. Calvinists believe that God sovereignly determines. Some Calvinists believe that God sovereignly determines everything. And if he sovereignly determines everything, is everything necessarily the case? Now that depends on whether God determined everything to be the way that it is, because God could not have determined it to be otherwise. So if God has free will, then the Calvinist can escape that trap. If some ultra super mega hyper Calvinist is like, not even God has a choice about that, then I guess he's in trouble.
So I'm back into that. If you say God is necessary, what are the implications then on I guess theological thought?
Yes.
Or the sovereignty of God?
Yes. So I think.
How do you tie the sovereignty of God to the necessity of God?
Depends on the definition of sovereignty, but what you mean by sovereign is that sovereignty can mean two things. God has the right to do whatever he wants, or God has the power to do everything he wants. I think God has both the right and the power to do anything he wants that's logically possible. The disagreement between, one of the disagreements between Calvinism and non-Calvinistic viewpoints, some Calvinism and some Calvinistic viewpoints, is many philosophers would say it is not logically possible for God to make a creature with free will choose to do something that that he wants them to do. That if the creature has will, then by definition, God's not the one telling the creature what to do. So it's usually a disagreement about what the word will means and what is logically possible. Okay. Yes, sir. And then Justin.
I don't know if this for some reason, but can you say that if something is necessarily existing, that you basically get to the point that you have to get to a God, like God has to exist?
That's the ontological argument.
Okay.
Yes. So that heads in the direction of ontological.
So I had to look it up because I didn't know what the term was, but I find that a lot of scientists' core beliefs are similar to Hinduism's absolutism. So it's basically your five things without the fourth one, or without the fifth one, the personal.
Okay.
So
yeah.
you know, that there is a force.
Yes?
It does exist, timelessly, spatially, immaterial, it is powerful, except it's just not personal.
Right.
And I'm not a Hindu, but I believe that's what they think too, that before their pantheon came up, there was something there.
Yeah.
I still think you have not got the personal down. I mean, although I believe it, so if we want to move on because...
No, I mean, we don't want to believe things because we believe them. We want to believe things because there are good reasons for it. So tell me how to get from state A to B if that which is in state A doesn't have the ability to, as Katie says, flip the switch.
It does.
Okay, how does it flip the switch?
Magic.
Because it was...
Well, no, I'm sorry, bad question. Why was the switch flipped?
because it was more likely that it would, or something. That's what they would say. Like it was going downhill, basically. That it was. This was the natural way that it was going to happen.
All right. If it was going downhill, then it's already in time. And if it's going downhill, then the state here is different than this. Okay. If it's teetering, it's moving.
You're using physics analogies. You have
Yes.
to remove the physics analogies.
No, I know. But I know. But I'm trying to argue from when you argue with a materialist who
Yes.
says that there is something that started this, but it's not
Yes.
a personal being.
What I would point out to that materialist is teetering is an oscillation, and oscillations occur in time. So you've still
You
got
could
time.
stop right before. You could have no time and have it.
Then it's not teetering. You
It's
know,
not
it's the same thing as the unicorn argument. It's a unicorn
Right,
is not a horse.
It's the same as the singularity, right?
Okay.
It's the same. I mean,
But to say the singularity teeters, and to say that the singularity exists timelessly, and to say the singularity exists necessarily, those are three different statements.
right, but I still think you haven't, like I said, Hinduism, they believe in most of the Eastern religions believe that there's something out there without a personal God.
Yeah, and that could be the case. But the point is, if it's not personal, then why does the switch flip? And the point, and the argument here is this: if something goes from one state to another, and it's not necessarily the case that it had to go from one state to another, and if this universe is contingent, it's not necessarily the case that it goes from one state to another. If it's not necessarily the case that it goes from one state to another, there has to be an explanation for why it went from one state to another. This thing exists continually in an unchanging state, is in no way an explanation for why it then goes to the next state. If this thing exists in a changing state and it has the potential or power
Or it interacts with something else.
to flip, it's okay, but now you've got something else. So you're calling in something else out of this existence, which is, you see what I'm saying? That this one is one that one cannot get around without doing what you're doing now, which is bringing another entity into it. This entity has to be a switch flipper. I'm sorry, Brian and Steve. Sorry, 1 second, Steve.
So to see if I understand, in this model where we've got A, we kind of have two choices, either a deterministic system or something that can make a decision, a will. And the argument is...
Well, let me stop you there. I think that you can't even a deterministic system won't get you there, because there has to be some explanation of why this deterministic system stayed in state A and was able to go to state B.
Well, I agree. The argument being, let's say we've got the ball teetering on the edge.
Yep.
In a deterministic system, if there's an infinite, we'll say, metaphysical causal regress,
Yes.
you can't have a deterministic system that eventually, at some infinite point in the
Yes.
future,
Yes.
will cause it to tip over.
Right.
So it's the two bits of the determinism and the infinite regress.
If you grant that determinism can do that, which I don't, but if you do, then you're stuck in the infinite regress problem. Yes, that's right.
So we talked about this. Let's say you admit that there has to be a will.
Okay.
What if there's 5 wills and 4 of the wills say,
Yeah.
I don't care?
Yeah, absolutely. That
And-
could be the
and-
case. This argument here, the cosmological argument, does not get you to this God or this God or this God. It doesn't get you there. It's only partway there. All right, so this one, the cosmological argument is simply an argument for an entity that has these properties. So when someone turns around and says, this is a cosmological argument for the existence of God, what they're saying is, it goes, unless you think that these are the only properties that God has, then all this is an argument for a God, not the God. Yeah.
Maximally great being, it would then all of a sudden.
Right.
Change the
You need further argument to get you to, well, this being is all good. There's no all good that flows out of this argument. You can't get there from here, so to speak. So you need a different argument to do that. But what it does is it gives you a reinforcement of the, here there's at least two possibilities. There's some God standing behind all this, some prime mover, it could just be prime mover, right? This was a Greek idea. There's a prime mover that sits behind all this, or a medieval idea. Where does the prime mover come from? Both of course. But what we can say about the prime mover based on this argument is that prime mover has to at least have these. And so now you have to start asking those questions. Well, why one God? Why not 5? Good question, different argument. Yes, sir.
Well, I just don't still see how the cosmological argument comes to that. I see how it comes to the universe as a cause.
Okay.
But like the argument, all men are mortal, Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But you can also just say, Socrates was mortal because he ate carrots every day.
Right.
That's
Or all men have beards. Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates has a beard. That's deductively, trivially true, but the first premise is false. Not all men have beards. Right. That's right. So let me ask this. Do you grant that the cosmological argument gives you this?
I would say so. I think the cosmological argument only gives the conclusion that the universe had a cause.
Yes.
I think if we add those into the cosmological argument, then those things would be valid.
Let me ask this. Let me say it this way. The cause of the universe, this is what this box should have been titled, must be these following things. So it must be, let's at least talk about these. It must be spaceless and immaterial, because by universe, the physical universe must be spaceless and immaterial, because space, matter, and energy came into existence. All right, so we're agreed that it gives you these. If that was also the beginning of time, do you agree that it gives you this? All right, so we're on the same page. By my fairly wishy-washy definition of powerful, do you agree that it gives you that? It at least has to bring this into existence. And it's not that easy. I can't do it. So it's at least more powerful than I am. So some sort of powerful. So really you also are disagreeing with how do you know that it's personal? All right, so why do you buy, if you don't buy the argument that says you have to have a switch flipper, do you have a belief about what the beginning of this universe looked like? Is it somehow different to this?
I don't know how it existed before then. There's no real evidence to say what was before the Big Bang, so right.
Well, we have some evidence now, right? We agree that there's some evidence of what existed before the Big Bang. Whatever existed before the Big Bang, at least we agree it has to be those 4, it has to have those 4 properties. Or let's say at least one thing that existed before the Big Bang has to have at least those 4 properties, right?
But isn't powerful material?
No, only if you think that there's no possible relationship between immaterial and material. That is to say, do you think that it's possible that immaterial things can have causes in a material world? If you think that it's possible, then you've got a reason for saying powerful is meaningful here. Okay, so now to what I would say is, on the personal side, I'm basically saying this. Here's the dot, here's the V. Okay, you're at the dot. We've made could there have been more dots beforehand? Metaphysically speaking, the answer is no. No more dots beforehand. Is it the case that physically speaking that could happen? No, we know it's not physically dots beforehand, because that was the beginning of the physical, or you end up in the Sean Carroll, this is just 2 universes coming out of it. Okay, it can't be a physical. How about one dot that's oscillating? Well, that's physical, because an oscillation is a back and forth, sinusoidal or something like that represented, and this is motion, this is change, this is time. So you basically, there's no way to get any of these dots beforehand, because they can't be an infinite number of dots. We've seen that. There can't be, there can't be at least one more dot. So how do you get to this point? It sits on the other side of this dot. And what we're making the point of being is, well, if there's no way for it to be, the cause of this, remember we're looking for the cause, that cause cannot be physical, it has to be all these things, and it has to change from this state S1 to this state S2, because we agree that this state right here, S2, did not always have to be. So we're talking about a movement from state 1 to state 2. And what I'm saying is this. Anytime you have a movement from state 1 to state 2, you have to have a cause for that movement from one to the other. If that cause is deterministic, the explanation exists in the laws. If that cause is not deterministic, then the explanation must be a switch flipper, a personal choice. That cause is that movement from S1 to S2 is not deterministic, therefore it must be personal. So if I was going to make an off-the-cuff argument, that's the one that I would make.
Yeah, I think this is one of those philosophical terms that just creates a lot of confusion, which is why I was asking what we meant by personal here, because I feel like all that's really being said is when you have a change, there's only two possibilities. There was a deterministic cause or there was a choice. So determinism or choice. So
Yes.
all we're saying here was it wasn't deterministic, it was chosen.
That's it.
That's a better answer. Yeah, so self-knowledge.
Yes.
Right? Because you have self-knowledge, you made a choice. It didn't happen naturally, it's not deterministic, therefore, it's personal.
I don't know that I understood that.
Because, so to be personal, you have to know that you know, or you know yourself, so
Yes,
self-knowledge.
okay.
That's how you can make choices, right? Because if you don't have free will, because you don't know, you're not, it's deterministic.
Yeah, I think a consciousness is self-aware, and okay, yes.
So that's the difference, I think.
Yes, that is certainly a
Choice versus determinism.
Yes.
So follow me here. I think I'm having these questions because we think of everything in time, space, and matter.
Yes.
Right? So I've got another problem.
Okay.
All right. So inputs and outputs, right?
Yep.
Regardless of the discussion we're having here about how it came, right? What the explanation is, if it's this like super compact, dense thing that just blows up into something bigger.
Yes.
Like that material had to have come from somewhere.
Yes.
Right? And if we
Yes.
get into the like, I don't even know if this is the law of physics, but you can't create matter, right? Like it,
Well, the law of conservation of matter and energy
Yeah.
says matter is neither created nor
Nor
destroyed.
destroyed.
But that's really meant to be bounded within this universe.
okay, fair. But guess this, I mean, at the risk of like, almost like a proof for God, no one else has the power to bring something out of nothing, right? So regardless of the
Well, we don't know. I mean, we don't know that. When we talk about a being that can bring something out of nothing, we tend to talk about only God doing that. But there's no logical argument yet that we've talked about that says there couldn't be some other being that maybe we call gods because anything more powerful than us is a god or something like that. But who says that only the God, the Judeo-Christian God, only that one can do that? Maybe other gods can do that. Are there, in the panoply of other heavenly beings, is there anything else that can create? Yeah. But there's no, I mean, to me, there's nothing that says it couldn't be the case.
But in our box here, we haven't even narrowed down a Judeo-Christian God yet.
That's right.
Just
We're not-
making the argument for God at this point, right? So we're still left.
Actually, yeah, all we've actually made an argument is for a cause with these properties. That is not yet God. But what you should recognize is this cause has some of the same properties that God has. And it's also the case.
I think what you said personal, it is a God.
Well,
it's not a natural, it's not a deterministic if you have personal.
And that depends on your definition of God. So if your definition of God is, hey, the only definition of God that counts is this is a greatest possible being. If that's your definition of God, then by definition there's only one. But if you mean kind of what we call little g gods, Hanuman and the other 300 million out there, yeah, who says the monkey god couldn't have been the guy who did this, right? That's a possibility. So yeah, we ain't there yet. All we've got is, we don't want to over-represent what this is. All you've got is a cause of the universe that looks like that.
I guess my problem is, maybe I just haven't read it yet, but there's no scientist out there who can come up with a non-godal argument for creating something out of nothing.
Sure, but let me put on their hat and say this. Just because you haven't thought of it doesn't mean it ain't there.
Okay.
Right? And at some point we got to be like, yep, that's right. We got to figure out, okay.
But I like my explanation better.
Yeah, Roger.
So,
Well, we'll get there eventually, but you don't want to get there quicker than it's justified.
so I've read or seen the little chart, and it says, I don't know who it's made by, but it says at the very beginning, quantum singularity.
Yes,
And so I'm like, okay, what do they mean by that?
yes.
Like I don't even know what they mean. Because that's their explanation, or at least that's what they put as the cause.
Yeah.
And so I'm just like.
So
okay.
it is the case that our best theory, we would say at least our most prolific theory, the one that seems to be most causally explanatory on the very small scale of the universe, is some sort of quantum theory. So what they're basically saying is, when you get to that size, when the universe is this big, actions happen that are not quantum. Me throwing this phone, that doesn't happen in what we would call a kind of quantum. It certainly, if everything is quantum, then it's the sum of a bunch of quantum interactions, but that is not what physicists refer to as a quantum interaction. You have to get down to a certain scale before things start behaving in ways that they would call, where what you're saying is these quantum forces become the dominant forces. So once you're at that size, what they're saying is this: when you get the universe down to that size, you're now at a size where quantum effects affect the whole universe. They are very, very important. In fact, they're the only things that are important. So now the question is, can things teeter? Can things oscillate? Can a Schrodinger wave equation, which is basically what quantum mechanics is, reduces to this wave equation, can it have influence if it's not moving in time? And the bottom line is,
Anything out of nothing, you know.
well, that's a separate question. But even at the okay, this stuff already exists, can it be oscillating? And the point is, no, it can't. Even there's a time dependent and there's a time independent Schrodinger equation, but there is no quantum. There are no quantum effects unless you evolve the quantum equations over time. There has to be a t in it in order for there to be an effect, and that's the point that we get to. Other stuff on necessity and contingency and all that stuff factor into the second part of your point.
So the box here you're calling the cause, is it a matter of definition, or am I going too far to say, what about calling it an entity? Are they?
Sure, yes, great.
Okay.
Yes, okay, that's fine. That's more than fine.
I'm not sure if I'm keeping up with what we're talking about, but is it right to say that the first cause would have to be personal because an impersonal thing doesn't act on its own initiative?
Yes, I think that is a statement that you could make that is true within everything that we said here. Yeah, and maybe it gets to the heart of it. Yeah, same point that a couple of people made, stated slightly differently, but yes, I think that's right. Okay, perfectly, we are now out of time, almost perfectly. So what I would say is this: I have at least made my best shot, if not my most concise shot, at arguing this. And let me, you have been a good opponent to this view the whole time. Do you buy this at this point? Okay, I'm going to use that at least as a reasonable barometer to say that this argument has been made to at least the point that we're going to make it given the time that we have. So we will entertain questions about this next time to anybody who wants to, but what we will do next time is move to the next argument. I have debated back and forth which one to do. Do you want to stay in the physicsy side of this, which is kind of like when apologists do this stuff. They do the cosmological argument, then they do the teleological argument, and then they move on down the road. Do you want to do this? Do you want to do a fine-tuning argument, which is a very physics-based argument, or do you want to do the moral argument next? And we could do either one of those. So show of hands for folks who want to do the moral argument next. Okay. All right, good. I'll take that as a majority right there.
Scott,
Yes, sir.
In fairness, we're going to come back to the physics argument.
We will.
No matter how hard you try, it's going to happen.
That does seem to be the case.
Don't be deterministic, just let it go.
Yeah, that's right. My will has nothing to do with that, does it? Okay, then what we'll start on is the moral argument next time, and let me lay out one of the key portions that I'm going to make about this, so that anybody who wants to think of oppositions, and I encourage people to, wants to think of opposing sides to this, knows I'm declaring ahead of time what my core premise is going to be. At least one objectively true moral proposition exists. And the one that I like to use, it's horrifying, but I like to use it because I've never heard anybody disagree with it, is, and you have to include all this in there, it is always morally evil. It is always morally evil to torture and murder a 4-year-old girl for fun. It is always morally evil to torture to death and murder a 4-year-old girl for fun. And think of the most horrific torture that your mind will allow you. Hopefully you don't do that for long. But whatever the worst thing is you could possibly do to that 4-year-old girl, that doing that is always evil. Even if nobody thinks it's the case. Even in a society where the Nazis won and the Mongols won, the hordes, whatever it is, and everybody thinks, that's fine, it's okay, they would still be wrong. If you think that's the case, that's at least one moral truth that is objectively true. So objective means it's true whether everybody believes it or anybody believes it or not. That's the important point, okay? That's good. If that one falls, my version of the moral argument, or the one that I understand, will not work. But if that remains true, or something like that remains true, then I think that this argument will work. But that's the key one. If you want to fight it, fight that proposition.
I assume you threw in for fun just to make it happen, because
to get rid of all of the, well, what if you had to do that in order to save 10 billion people?
Okay.
Or what if you had to do that because, or no, for some reason this 4-year-old girl was this moral agent that somehow deserved it, none of that. Just for your own amusement, because you think that it's entertaining to watch her scream. That's what I mean. You see? Okay. All right, very good. On that happy note, you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Thousands of different properties that are so close. I just if they give me advice on percentage, oh yeah, there's lots and lots of articles. I'll do it right now. So it was.